All right, this is a demonstration of viewing point data in input view. So we're going to take a look at a facility in my area of interest in my TEISS project. So the first thing I want to do is to click on the input button that's up here, and that's going to open up the linear data entry screen or the input view screen. So you'll see that that linear data entry screen is now open, and you'll see that by default it opens up with the point locations selected, and you can see the list of counties in my TEISS project on the right side of the screen. So my area of interest is in Coconino County, so I'm going to click on Coconino County to select it, and I want to see all of the facilities inside of Coconino County. So once that's selected, I can click on the Facilities button on my left-hand side of the screen, and that's going to list out all of the facilities in the NEI data that are in Coconino County. So I'll click on Facilities, and here you'll also notice, as we showed you in the slides, this shows the point sources data structure. It shows you have your point locations, your facilities, your release point, your emissions units, your processes, and if you scroll down, you can see there's even more until you come to the very end, which is your actual emissions. So we'll go ahead and click on Facilities, and you'll see that by default, my screen is scrolled down. So if I want to see the top, I scroll up, and we'll see that there's a total of 24 facilities in the NEI data that are in Coconino County. And the facility I want to take a look at is the EPNG, the Williams Compressor Station. And you'll see here that you can see that this is cutting off part of the name. If you want to expand that, you can do that by just holding and dragging. And then you can just move it over and see the whole name, or as much name you want. So we'll click on the Williams Compressor Station. That selects the facility. And now what I would like to do is look at what emission units are at that facility. And to do that, we're going to click on the Emission Units button here. And this shows us all of the emission units that are at Williams Compressor Station. And you'll see there's a total of 9 emission units here. So I'd like to look at what kind of data is collected for an emission unit. So for an example, I'm going to click on the first one here, and that's Emission Unit 001, and I want to look at the data entry screen for that unit. And to do that, I can either double click on that unit, or I can click on the Edit button. And remember that the Edit button, we don't necessarily have to edit data, we can just view the data. So it has a purpose of the View button and an Edit button. So we'll click Edit, and we'll take a look at what makes up the emission unit. We'll see here the different fields we can enter, and we'll see green fields and we see white fields. And those green fields are the mandatory fields for if you're submitting your data to the NEI, and the white fields are the optional fields. So we can see that we have an emission unit identifier filled in, a unit type code of unclassified. So that doesn't really tell us much about what kind of unit this is, a unit status code of operating. So we really didn't learn much by looking at the emission unit because there's not a lot of stuff filled in here. So I'm going to go ahead and close this and look at the process next. And when I close this, I'm going to use the X button here. And the reason I'm using that is to protect the integrity of the NEI data, because I don't want to change anything about the NEI data, since this is not my own data that I entered. I want to leave everything as it was. And if I click this X button, if I accidentally made a change here, it wouldn't be saved by TEISS. Whereas if I click the OK button, TEISS would have saved the change, and we don't want that. So we're going to click X to close. So we're going to take a look at the process. And the process is actually an event that occurs at the unit. So we'll see what happens, what kind of event is causing these emissions at the process. So we'll click on Process. And now we can see a list of the processes on the right the screen, and it's totally possible to have multiple processes associated with an emission unit. And like an emission unit is a physical thing at the facility. So examples are a boiler or a storage tank. And like if it was a storage tank at a gas station, you would definitely have multiple processes here. You would have a process for tank filling, tank breathing, tank emptying, etc. But this process is the only process that's associated with the unit. But it's not necessarily the only process associated with the entire facility, because remember, there's 9 emission units at this facility. So each of those is going to have its own process. But right now, we're only looking at emission unit 001 as shown in the breadcrumb panel above here. So we're going to take a look at the data entry window for this process, and we're going to click on it, and then we're going to click on the edit button to take a look at what event occurs at this unit that makes these emissions. We can see by the source classification code description that this is a natural gas, industrial natural gas event that's causing these emissions at this unit. So we'll click close on this button since we learned what we wanted to learn about this emission process. And if we wanted to look at processes at the other units, we have a couple options. And the first option would be to use this method that we used before and go back up to another emission unit by clicking on emission units in the left side of the screen. So we'll do that first. And we're going to click there, and we're going to take a look at emission unit 8 and see what kind of process occurs there. So we click 8, and then we click processes again, and we'll see now that we have a different source classification code. Process description is blank, and when you're entering your own data, we highly recommend that you enter data into these description fields because it's much easier to learn about the process that occurs at the unit if you enter the description now. Because if you don't, then you have to go into the edit view to see what the event actually is. So the other option to see the different processes at this facility is we can use the breadcrumb panel, and we could click through the different emission units, and we could see all of the processes for those units by just clicking. So if we click one forward, we'll see here's emission unit 9, and here's the process associated with emission unit 9. The next thing I want to do is to actually look at the emissions at these different processes. So we'll scroll down here on the left side of the screen, and we're going to select actual emissions. And this shows us that for emission unit 09, there's only one process associated with this emission unit, and we can see that by looking at these arrow buttons where it says 1 of 1, and we can see that there's only one reporting period, the annual reporting period, that's associated with this process. And we can see that the VOC emissions are 0.56 tons at this particular process of this particular emission unit. So keep in mind that that's not the entire facility emissions. That's only the emissions for that unit in that process. So if we want to see other emissions, we can do that by changing the emission unit and the process. So I'd like to see what about emission unit 8? So I can either click prior, that will bring up the emission unit 008, or I can click emission units here and see a list of all the emission units. So I'm going to click on 008, and that shows us that for that unit in this process, there's actually 11 pollutants and emissions for that particular unit. And that is it for point sources.